When using a compass, there are two things you need to know: magnetic north and your azimuth, which is the direction you need to go to reach your goal. In the United States, our political and moral compasses are off track, but it doesn't have to be that way. Come with me as I explore realistic options on how to improve our country. This is Off Azimuth. In 1862, Captain Lewis Hope began growing sugarcane on his property in Moreton Bay in Queensland, Australia. His pioneering efforts led to an explosion of sugarcane production throughout the colonization frontier, reaching the far north of the continent by the 1880s. Sugarcane, not being a native species to Australia, ran into a unique problem. Larvae of the native beetles ate at the roots of the plants. These larvae became collectively known as cane beetles, and they would become a persistent problem for the sugarcane industry for decades. In 1932, plant pathologist Arthur Bell attended a conference in Puerto Rico, where he discovered that the American toad, native to the island nation, had been effectively used in Hawaii to reduce the cane beetle population. 3 years later, a breeding sample of American toads were brought to Australia as a biological means to control the pests destroying the sugarcane harvest. By August of 1935, approximately 2,400 American toads, then renamed the cane toad, had been bred in captivity and were ready to be released into the sugarcane plantations. What happened next is a textbook example of the complexities of introducing an invasive species into an ecosystem. An invasive species is a plant or animal not native to the environment and that has little or no natural predators, which means there is nothing to properly control the exponential reproductive growth. The cane toad proved to be ineffective in controlling the cane beetles, but proved to be a voracious and indiscriminate feeder, capable of outcompeting the native Australian species. They secrete a toxin from their skin that is deadly to most predators. Very few native species can withstand the toxins, including the wolf spider and certain breeds of crocodiles, but these alone aren't enough to control the population. Though it's impossible to know the exact number of cane toads currently in Australia, just 90 years after their introduction, it's estimated that there are between 200 million to 1 billion cane toads currently on the continent. Invasive species like the cane toad can disrupt or even destroy an ecosystem. In 1987, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia spoke at length about a different type of invasive species. He said, "Winding in and out through the long, devious basement passage, crawling through the corridors, trailing its slimy length from gallery to committee room. At last it lies stretched at full length on the floor of Congress, this dazzling reptile, this huge, scaly serpent of the lobby." Except he wasn't talking about a plant or an animal. This invasive species, this reptilian monster that threatened all aspects of the congressional process that Byrd warned us about, was a different sort of creature altogether. He was talking about lobbyists. Lobbyists are defined as professionals who advocate for specific interests and work to influence lawmakers on policy decisions. They can represent corporations, nonprofit organizations, or trade unions. These practices are not only protected in the First Amendment, but it also encourages citizens, and by extension organizations, to petition the government for a redress of grievances. However, since the mid-1800s, lobbying has been the congressional equivalent of the Wild West, with little to no transparency, and the government suffering from numerous lobbying-related scandals. Included among them were the Credit Mobilier scandal under President Grant, the Whiskey Ring scandal of 1875, the Keating Five scandal in 1989, and the Jack Abramoff scandal in the early 2000s. Lobbying had become synonymous with corruption, an effort by corporations and wealthy individuals to manipulate politics for personal gain through hefty political contributions. But lobbying didn't start as a stepping stone for political corruption. The first lobbyist in the United States was Willaim Hull, a Revolutionary War veteran who was hired by fellow veterans from Massachusetts in 1792. The veterans requested back pay for winning the freedom for the newly formed nation. Hull arrived in Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, only to discover that none of the other states had sent lobbyists. Aside from building relationships with members of Congress, Hull created a coalition of similar veteran organizations, all of whom sought compensation from the war. Unlike many lobbyists of today, Hull's efforts were viewed largely as altruistic. His actions were protected by the First Amendment, which viewed his efforts as a form of petitioning the government. But what Hull didn't realize is that he created a new profession, one in which the line between legitimate lobbying and bribery was quickly blurred, and not at all subtly. By the mid-1800s, Samuel Colt, inventor of the famous Colt revolver, handed out firearms to lawmakers, even to the 12-year-old son of one congressman, to push for a patent extension. Following the Civil War, the rise of massive corporations, particularly railroads, steel, and oil, created demand for sustained influence in Washington, D.C. In the 1860s and 1870s, these corporations sought massive land grants for railroad construction, protective tariffs, and government subsidies. It was no longer about gaining one-time favors from politicians. These corporations required ongoing pressure on the political system. This led to the creation of what was dubbed the Third House of Congress, a body of lobbyists with as much influence as the elected officials. Union Pacific Railroad's credit mobilier scandal demonstrated just how ingrained corruption had become in the political process. Between 1864 and 1868, Congress created the Pacific Railroad Acts, which intended to establish a transcontinental rail line from the Missouri River to the Pacific. Union Pacific knew that they could complete the work for approximately $50 million, but they also knew that Congress had allocated as much as $100 million for the project. Union Pacific created a shell company called Credit Mobilier of America, which served as a subcontractor for Union Pacific. By charging exorbitant fees through Credit Mobilier for construction, Union Pacific earned $94 million, though only spent less than half of that on the construction itself. The rest of the money was used to bribe several Washington politicians, including the vice president, for laws, funding, and regulatory rulings favorable to Union Pacific. In 1875, just 3 years after the Union Pacific scandal was published in the New York Sun, the whiskey ring scandal was exposed. From 1871 to 1875, whiskey producers and distributors had bribed U.S. Treasury officials to evade taxes on the whiskey sold. Distilleries and leaders of the whiskey ring received as much as $60,000 each from the increased revenue, which is the equivalent of $1.8 million in 2026. They used this money to fund Republican campaigns, instating politicians willing to continue the scandal. It wouldn't be until the 1930s before Congress began passing legislation to limit lobbying activities. In 1938, the Foreign Agents Registration Act required anyone lobbying on behalf of a foreign government to disclose their activities, in large part out of fear of Nazi propaganda influencing the U.S. government. 8 years later, Congress began focusing on domestic lobbying. The 1946 Lobbying Registration Act required anyone spending 50% or more of their paid time directly lobbying the federal government to register and file quarterly reports. The 1946 Act was riddled with flaws, creating loopholes by which lobbyists managed to sidestep the act by avoiding direct in-person lobbying or claiming that it wasn't their primary job. In 1954, the Supreme Court case United States v. Harris further gutted the Lobbying Registration Act, ruling that only lobbyists who met lawmakers in person and tried to influence a specific bill had to register. This excluded contracts with congressional staff, the executive branch, and all grassroots lobbying. Following the Supreme Court case, it would be another 40 years before any further attempt was made to legislate lobbying in Washington. In 1983, total lobbying spent was estimated around $200 million. By 1990, that number was estimated at $1.4 billion. A 1991 Government Accountability Office study found that of the 13,500 individuals and organizations conducting lobbying activities, nearly 10,000 were not registered under the Act, nor were they required to, based off the narrowed scope established from the Supreme Court case. It wasn't just lobbyists from outside Washington, D.C. attempting to influence political discourse. By 1990, approximately 40% of retiring members of Congress registered as lobbyists, which raised concerns about conflicts of interest and regulatory loopholes. The 1995 Lobbying Disclosure Act attempted to close all the loopholes that had existed throughout the 20th century. The LDA provided much clearer lobbyist definitions, including anyone making more than one lobbying contract or spending at least 20% of their time lobbying for a client. It introduced new restrictions on former government officials entering the industry, and it expanded covered officials to include not just Congress, but all congressional staff and senior executive branch members. As effective as the LDA was at expanding lobbying transparency, it didn't completely stop the corruption. In the early 2000s, prominent lobbyist Jack Abramoff worked for Native American tribes to influence legislation for the gaming and casino industry. He was wildly successful, in large part because he directly bribed numerous politicians, most famously Representative Bob Ney, and indirectly bribed hundreds of congressional politicians through campaign contributions and gifts to congressional aides. In 2006, Abramoff was convicted of 3 felony counts: conspiracy, fraud, and tax evasion. As a result of the scandal, many of the congressmen redirected any campaign contributions from Abramoff to charity instead. Abramoff's scandal led to the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act in 2007. The act created a public, searchable online database of lobbyists and their contracts, increasing transparency for the public. It tightened revolving door restrictions, extending the period politicians and staff must wait before transitioning to lobbying. It forced lobbying to become a compliance-driven profession, but it didn't stop lobbying. By 2025, lobbying was a $4.2 billion industry. Between 1998 and 2025, the health sector spent $12.97 billion on lobbying, which includes $387 million in 2024 alone. That's followed by the finance and real estate industry, which spent $4.27 billion, and the communications and electronics industry, which spent $3.66 billion during that same period. Lobbyists themselves have continued to seek loopholes in existing legislation. In recent years, the number of officially registered lobbyists has remained stable, hovering between 12,000 to 13,000, despite a clear increase in the number of lobbyists. This is in part because industry professionals are creating shadow lobbying, which involves individuals calling themselves advisors, consultants, or public affairs experts, while still conducting traditional lobbying activities. This shift in influence began in large part because of the 2010 Supreme Court case, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. In the case, Citizens United wanted to air a film critical of Hillary Clinton, but federal law prohibited corporations and unions from using general treasury funds for electioneering communications close to elections. The 5-4 case struck down the long-standing ban on independent political spending by corporations and unions. The major result of the decision was that for political spending purposes, corporations have the same free speech rights as people. This decision led to the creation of super political action committees, or super PACs. These committees are able to raise unlimited funds from corporations and wealthy donors and can spend unrestricted amounts to advocate for or against political candidates. This has led to an explosion in political spending by wealthy organizations and individuals who seek to influence the political process. In 2006, it was estimated that expenditures from corporate and wealthy private entities were less than $5 million. In the 2024 presidential election, that number was closer to $1 billion. In a normal political cycle, nonprofit organizations will conduct grassroots lobbying, which attempts to influence public opinion and encourages citizens to contact their representatives. With their exceptional wealth, super PACs operate a version called astroturfing, which is the practice of creating fake grassroots campaigns that are controlled by wealthy corporations rather than nonprofits. They typically use misleading names that begin with things like Citizens For. Some of the most popular AstroTurf campaigns were the California Drivers Alliance, which created false impressions of consumer backlash against clean energy initiatives, and the National Smokers Alliance, which created fake opposition to smoking bans. While super PACs have changed the election landscape and can greatly influence the political election cycle, it doesn't get at the root of political corruption, which is the desire for elected officials to become wealthy. While it's a gross generalization to say that all politicians get elected to get rich, there's an interesting quote that I found that highlights the issue. Senator Mark Hanna of Ohio said, "There are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is." That would not have felt out of context if it had appeared in a news article in 2026. But Senator Hanna didn't say that recently. In fact, Mark Hanna died in 1904. Over 100 years ago, he highlighted the inherent corruption within the federal government. The concept of politicians using their position of influence for personal gain is nearly as old as the nation itself. What has changed is the process by which they make their money. It is estimated that approximately 300 of the 535 members of Congress are millionaires, most of their money being made from real estate and investments. And for a group of politicians elected to represent their constituents, the wealth divide between the constituent and the politician is massive. In 1978, Congress passed the Ethics in Government Act, which required many elected officials to file an annual financial disclosure statement that reveals their assets, investments, and other business interests. It's through these reports that bipartisan organizations can monitor and process how investing has built fortunes among our elected officials. Quiver Quantitative used the 2024 financial reports to identify the wealthiest congresspeople. The top of the list was Senator Rick Scott of Florida, with an estimated net worth of $327 million. Second was Representative Vern Buchanan of Florida, with $249 million. And third was Representative Nancy Pelosi of California, with $247 million. It can be argued that much of their wealth is a result of their entrepreneurship. Senator Scott co-founded the Columbia Hospital Corporation in 1987, which purchased for-profit hospitals to create a medical network. He served as its CEO, and that of HCA Healthcare following a merger, until he stepped down in 1993. Representative Buchanan's wealth came from a chain of automobile dealerships. Representative Pelosi, while certainly the most egregious example, highlights the legal gray area that comes when politicians can buy and sell stocks. When Pelosi entered Congress in 1987, she and her husband were worth an estimated $10 million. Over the next 37 years, her wealth grew by 2,292%. She and her husband earned more than $130 million from stock trading during her tenure. While she is the focal point of many arguments against allowing sitting politicians to invest in stocks, she's merely the tip of the iceberg. Since 2021, more than 100 members of Congress have made around 10,000 trades per year. Capital Trades reported that in 2025, 140 members of Congress made 14,451 trades, totaling over $720 million in shares and other assets. The 2025 worst offenders included Representative Ro Khanna of California, who made 4,284 trades, totaling $59.57 million. Representative Lisa McClain of Michigan, who made 1,381 trades, totaling $12.84 million. And Representative Michael McCall of Texas, who made 1,059 trades, totaling $79.73 million. Of the 140 members who participated in the 2025 stock trading, 32% of their portfolios outperformed the S&P 500, which showed returns of 16.6%, with 2 representatives showing returns in excess of 70%. How did these members of Congress manage to outperform the average stock market returns? That's where we reach the legal gray area. Members of Congress are not prohibited from trading stocks that involve companies that might be affected by legislation being considered, or companies they oversee through committee assignments. While insider trading laws do apply to Congress, information gained from their work may or may not qualify as insider information. So long as they are reporting trades over $1,000, as per the 2012 Stock Act, then they are generally free to trade as they desire. That's not to say that conflicts of interest don't exist. A 2022 New York Times analysis found that 97 members of Congress, nearly a fifth of the elected officials, made trades from 2019 to 2021 that could be considered conflicts of interest. For example, in 2020, former Senator Richard Burr received a behind-closed-door briefing on the worldwide effects of the COVID pandemic. He immediately sold between $628,000 and $1.7 million in personal stocks. A week later, the stock market crashed because of public anxiety associated with the pandemic. Despite sitting on the Senate Committee for Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, in August 2023 alone, Senator Tommy Tuberville traded $250,000 in stocks for wheat, corn, soy, and cattle, all of which is monitored and affected by the committee on which he sits. As technology expands, so does the opportunities for insider trading, and it's no longer limited to just members of Congress. Emerging prediction market companies like Polymarket allow people to place bets on some of the most inane topics, thereby expanding investment opportunities beyond the stock market. But these bets are ripe for corruption. The day before the Special Forces raid in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Army Master Sergeant Van Dyke, a Special Forces soldier who was briefed on the upcoming mission, invested more than $34,000 in Polymarket, specifying the exact day and time that Maduro would be captured. His bets netted more than $436,000. Despite immediately withdrawing his winnings and deleting his account, it didn't take long for law enforcement to expose the corrupt betting practices. He was able to make these trades because while all the trades on these markets are transparent and public, the traders themselves remain anonymous, which has opened the door for this new version of insider trading. But Congress and the military aren't alone in conducting questionable trades. As described by Nick Marsh in a BBC report, these practices of using privileged information to advise stock trades exist at the highest level. Someone within President Trump's inner circle is using their connections to him to make billions of dollars. Following his Liberation Day broad tariffs, on 9 April 2025 at 6:18 p.m., President Trump announced a tariff pause. 18 minutes before his announcement, trading jumped from hundreds of trades per minute to over 10,000 per minute. In mid-February 2026, 6 accounts were created on Polymarket that bet that the United States would conduct a strike on Iran by 28 February. When President Trump confirmed the attack, those 6 accounts netted over $1.2 million between them. One of those accounts later earned an additional $163,000 by correctly betting on a U.S.-Iran ceasefire on 7 April. On 9 March of this year, the price of oil hovered around $100 a barrel. At 7:16 p.m., CBS published an interview with President Trump, where he stated that the war in Iran was nearly complete. His proclamation resulted in oil prices dropping over 14%. 47 minutes before the CBS story went live, over 7,000 trades in oil were conducted. The London Stock Exchange Group noted 4 instances in which traders bet that oil prices would drop just moments before an announcement from the White House. These 4 investments alone netted over $2.6 billion. These investments raised enough red flags that both the Department of Justice and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission have opened investigations into these trades. While all this information is circumstantial, it lends credence to the idea that our elected officials are using their privileged information to make billions of dollars in investments. Insider trading has been illegal since the Securities Act was passed in 1933, and the restrictions were expanded for elected officials with the 2012 Stock Act. Even so, not a single politician has been prosecuted for insider trading in the past 14 years. If this is to ever change, if the process of elected officials using their position for personal gain is ever to be curtailed, then politicians need to be banned from buying and selling stocks. And this is not an unpopular opinion. A 2023 Nielsen survey found that 86% of Americans support a ban on members of Congress trading on individual company stocks. Efforts have been made to curtail political stock trading. In September 2023, Senators John Ossoff and Mark Kelly introduced the Banned Congressional Stock Trading Act, which would require members of Congress and their family members to divest from their stocks and place them in a blind trust. Senator Ossoff said at the time, "Members of Congress should not be playing the stock market while we make federal policy and have extraordinary access to confidential information. Stock trading by members of Congress massively erodes public confidence, with serious appearance of impropriety." The act ultimately failed to advance out of committee and was never voted on the congressional floor. The Ending Trading and Holdings in Congressional Stocks Act, better known by the acronym ETHICS, took the proposal one step further by prohibiting all members of Congress from buying or selling stocks 90 days after enactment, and prohibiting members' spouses or dependent children from trading stocks starting in 2027. It would have also required the president and vice president to divulge investments and divest them from being able to further buy or sell stocks. While the Ethics Act ultimately advanced out of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs in July, it has yet to be voted on by Congress. That is in large part due to resistance from the political leadership. On 14 May of this year, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson stated that with congressional salaries being frozen at $174,000 per year since 2009, officials should be allowed to conduct stock trading to support their families. The interview segment that circulated on social media failed to include the rest of the contextual information, which included Speaker Johnson stating that he could support a hypothetical ban on congressional trading. It also didn't take into consideration that elected officials are required to maintain 2 mortgages, one in their home state and one in Washington, D.C. However, at a time when the minimum wage remains frozen at $7.25 per hour, also since 2009, and the median annual household income is $83,000 per year, requesting the ability to continue insider trading feels tone-deaf. Congress's stock trading capabilities need to be limited. Bills like the Ethics Act help maintain integrity within the congressional process, ensuring that our officials aren't using classified information and briefings as a foundation for their investments. But these acts aren't effective if they're regularly blocked by the very people whose access to wealth would become limited. Even if the investments don't overlap into the financial and legal gray areas, the perception of impropriety is often as bad as the act itself. Furthermore, the influence of lobbyists, or consultants or advisors or whatever name they choose to give themselves, must be curtailed. Nonprofit lobbying, speaking for groups that are underrepresented within a given constituency, is understandable. But corporate lobbying should be stopped completely within Washington, D.C. Our officials weren't elected to represent the will and interests of corporations. If the interests of the corporations truly aligned with the best interests of a state's constituency, then there wouldn't be a need to offer quid pro quo to a member of Congress. The member of Congress would already be voting in the interests of everyone involved. Federal government positions were never intended to make members of Congress wealthy. Former Senator Mike Udall stated, "Public service is a privilege, not a path to personal wealth." President Woodrow Wilson really emphasized the point. He said, "You are not here merely to make a living. You are here in order to enable the world to live more amply, with greater vision, with a finer spirit of hope and achievement. You are here to enrich the world, and you impoverish yourself if you forget the errand." Our elected officials have drifted off azimuth, from insider trading to political infighting to gross overspending. It's time for the people, those who held the power to elect the politicians in the first place, to remind them of their solemn obligation, not to themselves or their party or corporate interests, but to the citizens of the United States. This is the final episode in Season 1 of Off Azimuth. I hope you've enjoyed this journey and look forward to more in the future. Season 2 will begin in the winter of 2026, and I hope all of you will join me again as I explore ways in which we can improve the nation and the world around us. Thank you for tuning in.